The first time the doorbell camera caught him, the clip looked like an ordinary night visitor in heavy weather. The man stood on the porch under a dim light, hands at his sides, facing the door without moving. He did not press the button, and he did not knock. Yet the motion alert still triggered. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Nora Kells watched the recording twice before waking her husband, Dean, who worked early shifts and hated disturbances. Dean squinted at the screen, shrugged, and said it was probably a neighbor checking addresses during the snow. Nora believed him at first because the man did not behave aggressively and the camera quality blurred details. They lived in a small house on the outskirts of a lake town where winter storms arrived hard and stayed long. Their porch faced a narrow street lined with pines, and plows often built high walls along the curb. In early December that year, the snow came late, then arrived all at once during one brutal weekend. The alert came shortly after 2 in the morning, which already felt wrong in a quiet neighborhood like theirs. Nora had gotten up for water and noticed the phone screen glowing with the camera notification on her nightstand. She opened it, expecting a raccoon, and saw a man framed perfectly in the porch view. He wore a dark coat that reached his thighs, with no hat despite the falling snow. His face was pale in the porch light, though not pale in a sick way, more like overexposed camera glare. He looked middle-aged, with a straight posture that made him seem taller than the doorframe behind him. Snow blew across the lens, yet the man remained centered as if the storm avoided him. Nora watched the clip end with him still standing there, then the screen returned to idle. Dean checked the porch through the curtain and saw nothing except drifting snow and their own steps half buried. He told her the man probably moved on once he realized the house was not who he wanted. Nora tried to accept that, but the clip bothered her because there was no visible approach. The motion recording began with him already on the porch, as if he appeared between frames. They forgot about it over the following weeks because work and school schedules consumed their attention. Their daughter Wren turned 9 that winter and needed help with homework and winter clothing. The house stayed warm, the routine stayed normal, and the memory became a story told lightly over dinner. Nora still kept the clip saved, though, because it felt too strange to delete. The next winter, the man returned on the first night of heavy snow, as if he followed the season instead of a calendar. The alert arrived at the same time, a little after 2 in the morning, and Nora woke before the phone even chimed. She opened the app with a sudden certainty, and her stomach tightened when the porch view loaded. The same man stood there again, in the same position, facing the door without moving. This time, Dean watched the clip with her, fully awake within seconds. He asked whether the timestamp was correct, then checked the date and the year on the screen. The app listed the current year, not a replay or a saved file, and the new clip sat beside the old one. Nora placed the 2 recordings side by side and noticed details matching too closely for comfort. The porch light cast the same shadow angle across the railing despite a bulb replacement the previous spring. The man's coat collar sat at the same height, and his hands hung at the same distance from his pockets. Even his stance seemed identical, feet planted as if on marked spots in the boards. Dean said it could be the same person repeating a prank, though the idea made little sense. If it was a prank, it required someone to stand motionless in deep winter weather without pressing the doorbell once. It also required someone to return after a year and time it with the first major snowstorm of the season. Nora felt a different explanation hovering, one she refused to say out loud in front of Wren. Dean tried to sound practical, suggesting they would speak with neighbors and adjust the camera angle. The following day, they asked people on both sides of the street if anyone noticed a man on their porch overnight. No one reported seeing anyone walking the road at that hour, and no one admitted to any joke. A neighbor across the street, older and blunt, suggested it might be someone lost or confused. Nora agreed outwardly, though the stillness in the man's posture did not fit panic or confusion. Dean installed a second camera facing the driveway, hoping to capture any approach route. He also replaced the motion settings with a higher sensitivity, expecting to record the figure earlier. When the next heavy snow arrived weeks later, the porch camera triggered again at 2 in the morning. The man stood in his usual spot, yet the driveway camera showed nothing at all. The driveway view recorded only falling snow and the occasional gust shifting shadows near the mailbox. There was no vehicle, no foot traffic, no shape moving toward the porch from either side. The porch clip began with the man already present, and ended with him still present, then nothing more. Nora watched the snow streaks carefully, hoping to see the man vanish or walk away. The clip never showed a departure. By the third winter, the family anticipated the first appearance like a dreaded holiday tradition. Nora found herself checking forecasts with unusual attention, watching for the first night that would qualify as a real storm. Dean pretended the situation no longer bothered him, but he began locking the storm door earlier each evening. Wren, older now, noticed the tension and asked why her parents kept staring at the porch camera feed. They told her there had been a stranger on the porch in past winters and that they wanted to be careful. Wren asked why they did not call police, and Dean answered that there was no crime to report. Nora said they would call if the man ever tried the door or spoke through the intercom. Wren accepted that explanation, but she began sleeping with her bedroom lamp on during storms. That winter, the man returned again. On the first night, snow fell thick enough to hide the street line. The alert came at 2:13 in the morning, matching the minute from previous years within a narrow margin. Nora sat up and opened the app, her hands cold even under blankets. The porch light revealed the same face, the same coat, the same unmoving posture. The camera audio captured only wind and a faint low hum that might have been electrical noise. Dean went downstairs and stood behind the door, listening for any sound from outside besides weather. He heard nothing, yet the camera feed showed the man clearly, breathless and still in the cold. Dean spoke through the door without opening it, asking what the man wanted and whether he needed help. The man did not respond, and he did not even shift his head toward the speaker. Dean tried the intercom feature next, which sent a chime and a two-way voice channel through the doorbell system. The chime rang from the outdoor speaker sharp against the storm, and the microphone activated. Nora watched the man's face closely, expecting a flinch or a change in expression. Nothing changed, and the man did not speak, as if the sound never reached him. After 10 minutes, the motion alert ended, and the camera returned to idle recording. Nora expected the man to remain visible in the live feed, but when she opened the live view, the porch was empty. Snow drifted against the railing, and their welcome mat lay curled slightly at one corner. The man was gone without any visible transition between recorded clips. Dean opened the curtain and saw only empty porch boards. The next day, Nora reviewed every clip from midnight to sunrise across both cameras. The porch clip began with the man already present and ended with him still present, then silence. The driveway camera showed no approach and no exit, only blowing snow and shifting shadows. The only oddity was a brief flicker in the porch light during the minute the motion started. Nora had not noticed it live, but it showed in the saved footage clearly. She researched the camera model, reading about infrared glitches and temperature-related sensor problems. She tried to convince herself it could be a software artifact, a corrupted frame repeated year after year. Yet the timestamps were new each season, and the files had unique data sizes. Dean suggested they upgrade the system entirely, removing any chance of old footage replaying. Nora agreed, though part of her feared that a clearer image would make the truth harder. They installed a new doorbell camera with higher resolution and better night vision before the fourth winter began. Dean also mounted a floodlight camera above the garage, covering the porch from a second angle. Nora tested both systems repeatedly, making sure they recorded instantly with motion. When the first snowstorm arrived, she waited with a knot in her stomach for the inevitable alert. It came at 2:11 in the morning, 2 minutes earlier than last year. The new camera showed the man more clearly than she ever wanted. His coat looked old-fashioned, with a stiff collar and a texture like heavy wool. His face appeared smooth in a strange way, not youthful, more like softened features in harsh lighting. His eyes reflected the infrared glow without the normal sparkle of moist pupils. Nora zoomed in and felt her heart drop when she saw his lips were slightly parted, yet no breath cloud formed. The floodlight camera triggered at the same moment, and its angle revealed the porch boards under his feet. There were no footprints in the snow near the steps, and the snow on the walkway looked untouched. The man stood as if placed there, feet aligned with the same porch plank seam. The floodlight brightened briefly, then settled, and the man remained perfectly still. Dean watched beside Nora, his jaw tight, saying nothing. That morning, Dean drove to the county records office and requested old property maps for their neighborhood. Nora did not know why at first, then realized he was searching for any past event tied to their address. The clerk, bored and helpful, printed a brief history showing the house had been rebuilt after a fire decades earlier. The note listed a winter date and a male name associated with the old structure. Dean brought the paper home and laid it on the table without speaking. The name on the record was Calvin Mare, and the date matched the winter month when the first camera appearance happened. Nora looked up the name in the public obituary archive and found a short entry from the same decade. The photograph showed a man in a dark coat standing outside a cabin, face slightly blurred from old print quality. Nora stared at the photo until her eyes hurt, because the shape of the jaw and the spacing of the eyes matched what the camera showed on her porch. Dean tried to explain it as coincidence, but his voice sounded thin when he said it. Nora asked why the man would appear at their rebuilt house at the same hour on the first storm each winter. Dean had no answer that stayed steady. Wren listened from the hallway, quiet and pale, absorbing more than they wanted her to hear. Nora sent her upstairs, then sat with Dean and made a choice. They would not open the door, but they would speak to him again, clearly and calmly, to see whether anything changed. The next storm arrived 2 weeks later, though it was lighter and arrived earlier in the night. At 2:12, the alert chimed, and the man stood on the porch again, unchanged by the year or the cold. Nora activated the intercom and asked his name in a steady voice. For several seconds, there was only wind hiss and the faint hum of the camera system. Then the man moved, not a full step, but a slow tilt of his head toward the speaker. The motion was so small that Dean doubted it happened until Nora replayed it frame by frame. The man's mouth opened slightly wider, and the speaker crackled as if the microphone caught something distant. A sound emerged that resembled a name, low and warped, like a word spoken through thick cloth. Dean leaned close to the phone and asked what he wanted. The man did not answer with words, but he raised one hand a few inches, then lowered it again. The gesture looked like a half attempt to knock, stopped before contact, as if he remembered a rule he could not break. Nora felt tears prick her eyes from fear rather than sadness. She asked whether he was looking for his cabin, and the man's head tilted again, slower. The cameras flickered for a brief second, then resumed. In that second, the man's outline blurred, and the porch light dimmed as if power dropped. When the image stabilized, the man stood in the same position again, hand down, face forward. The clip ended minutes later with no movement. When Nora opened the live feed after the alert ended, the porch was empty again. After that night, the family changed their habits in small ways. Dean kept the porch light on all night during winter, though it raised the electric bill. Nora placed salt along the steps and photographed the pattern each evening, hoping to detect any disturbance. Wren stopped looking at the porch during storms and kept her curtains closed. Still, the man appeared each winter, always during the first true blizzard night, always just after 2. In the 6th winter, Nora finally did something she had avoided because it felt like inviting the unknown closer. She opened the front door after the alert ended, stepping onto the porch in daylight hours later, and placed an old printed photo in a plastic sleeve. The photo showed Calvin Mare in front of the long-gone cabin, coat collar raised, expression neutral. Nora taped the sleeve to the door near the camera, then waited for the next storm. When the night came, the alert sounded as usual, and the man appeared in the frame. He stood facing the door, then his eyes shifted downward toward the taped photo. For the first time, his expression changed in a way the camera could capture. His brow tightened slightly, and his lips pressed together as if holding back a word. He raised his hand higher than ever before, and for a moment it hovered near the doorbell button. Nora watched from upstairs with Dean beside her, both of them holding their breath. The man did not press the button. Instead, he touched the plastic sleeve lightly, then withdrew his hand with slow care. The sleeve did not crinkle, and the tape did not move, yet the gesture looked like recognition. The porch light dimmed once, then steadied, and the man's outline softened at the edges. The clip ended with him still present, and the live feed later showed empty boards again. After that, he did not appear during minor storms, only during the first heavy blizzard of each winter. The family came to believe, quietly, that something in the weather made the boundary thinner. Nora never said the word ghost, yet she began thinking of the man as trapped in a routine tied to the old cabin that burned. Dean stopped trying to dismiss it with technical explanations. Wren grew older and learned to live with the idea that not every visitor belonged to the living. On the 9th winter, the county experienced a record cold snap, and the storm arrived with unusual pressure changes. The alert came at 2:10, and the man appeared, as always, coat dark against the pale porch. This time, however, the camera audio captured a clearer sound beneath the wind. It resembled a slow exhale and a faint tapping rhythm, like knuckles against wood heard from far away. Nora felt her chest tighten as she listened, because the rhythm sounded like a restrained knock. Dean spoke through the intercom one last time, voice low and steady, telling the man that the cabin was gone. He said the fire ended long ago, and the family living here could not help him return to that night. He told the man he could stop coming, that he could rest, that the door would not open. The porch image flickered, and for a moment, the man's face looked less blank, more tired, like someone who finally understood time had moved. The man raised his hand, and this time he knocked once, softly, on the door panel beneath the taped photo. The microphone caught the sound clearly, a single gentle tap that carried through the speaker into Nora's hands. Then the man lowered his hand and stepped backward, the first full step any camera had captured. The motion was slow, careful, and his feet left no prints in the snow. He took a second step, and his outline thinned, like mist and wind. By the time the clip ended, the porch was empty, and the live feed showed only drifting snow. Nora replayed the footage until morning, watching the two steps again and again, afraid she might imagine them. Dean saved the clip in multiple places, as if proof could protect them from doubt. That winter, the man did not return after the first storm. In the following winter, the first blizzard arrived, and the doorbell camera recorded nothing but snow and quiet light. Nora still checks the feed sometimes when wind rises and the porch light flickers. Dean still locks the door early and keeps the cameras updated. Wren, now grown, tells friends that her parents' house once had a winter visitor who never rang the bell. None of them can prove what the man truly was, only what the footage showed year after year. They know the same man appeared every winter until one night he finally learned how to leave. In this new story, the storm arrived faster than predicted, swallowing the rural road in thick white curtains before night fully settled. By the time the Henderson family pulled into the gravel driveway, snow already coated the porch steps and pressed against the sides of the house. Wind pushed drifts up the walls, turning the familiar outline of their home into something half buried and isolated. The house had belonged to Mark Henderson's parents before him, a squat two-story structure built decades earlier on land that sloped gently toward a frozen field. It had a crawl space beneath the first floor, shallow and unfinished, used mostly for pipes and storage bins no one had opened in years. Mark rarely thought about it, and neither did his wife, Claire. That evening, they settled in early. Power flickered once, then held. Claire prepared a simple dinner while Mark checked weather updates that grew steadily worse. Their two children, Evan and Lucy, played quietly in the living room, aware enough to sense tension even if they did not understand it. By 8, the snowstorm had erased all sound beyond the walls. The wind howled steadily, rattling window frames and making the house creak in protest. The isolation felt complete, like the world outside had been switched off. The first knock came just after 9. It was faint, almost lost beneath the wind, a dull, hollow sound that seemed to come from nowhere specific. Claire paused mid-sentence, spoon hovering over a pot, and looked at Mark. He shrugged, assuming something had shifted outside, maybe a branch hitting the siding. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, muffled, and deep. The sound did not come from the door. It came from below their feet. Evan stopped playing and looked down at the floor. Lucy clutched the edge of the couch, eyes wide. Mark felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with cold. They all listened. The house settled. Wind roared. Then silence. Mark laughed too quickly and said it was probably the pipes reacting to temperature changes. Claire nodded, though unease lingered in her eyes. The children accepted the explanation with the fragile trust of kids who wanted to believe adults always understood things. They finished dinner and moved into the living room. The television stayed low, more for comfort than entertainment. Outside, snow continued piling against the house, sealing them further in. At 9:30, the knocking returned. This time, it was unmistakable. 3 knocks again, harder now, resonating through the floorboards like someone tapping directly against the underside of the house. The sound came from beneath the living room near the center of the floor. Lucy screamed. Mark muted the television and stood up slowly. His heart pounded hard enough that he felt it in his throat. Claire pulled the children close, whispering for them to stay calm. Mark crouched and pressed his palm against the floor. Nothing moved. No vibration followed. The floor felt solid and cold. He told himself it had to be the wind forcing snow into some hollow space or ice shifting around the foundation. The crawl space was old, poorly insulated, full of echoes. Sound could travel strangely in storms like this. Still, the rhythm bothered him. It sounded deliberate. Mark went to the back door and opened it just enough to feel the wind slam against him. Snow blasted sideways across the porch, reducing visibility to almost nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just white and darkness. He shut the door and locked it. The knocking came again almost immediately. This time, it moved. 3 knocks under the living room floor, followed by a pause, then 3 more closer to the hallway. The sound traveled beneath the house, slow and methodical, as if something were crawling underneath, stopping to test the floor above. Claire whispered Mark's name, panic rising in her voice. Evan began crying softly, burying his face in her sweater. Lucy stared at the floor, frozen. Mark grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knelt and shone the light along the floor, knowing it was useless but unable to stop himself. Another knock answered him, directly beneath his knees. Mark recoiled backward, heart racing. The sound was too close, too precise. Something was under the house. He went to the utility closet and pulled open the crawlspace access door. Cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of damp earth and old insulation. He hesitated, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut across dirt, support beams, storage boxes, and tangled pipes. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Then the knocking came again, from inside the crawlspace. 3 knocks against the underside of the floor, close enough that dust drifted down from the beams. Mark slammed the access door shut and locked it, hands shaking. Claire demanded they call someone. Mark reached for his phone and felt his stomach drop. No signal. The storm had knocked out service completely. The landline crackled uselessly when he tried it. Another knock came, harder now, directly beneath the hallway. Then another. The rhythm changed. Instead of 3 evenly spaced knocks, the sound became irregular, faster, closer together, impatient. Lucy began screaming again. Claire held both children tightly, tears streaming down her face as she begged Mark to do something. The knocking stopped. For several long seconds, there was only the sound of wind and the children's sobs. Mark stood in the center of the hallway, flashlight clenched in his fist, waiting for the next sound. It came from beneath the kitchen. A scraping noise, slow and dragging, followed by a single knock. Then another scrape. Whatever was under the house was moving toward the warmest part of it. Mark backed toward the living room, herding his family with him. He told them to stay together, to stay quiet. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. The floor beneath the kitchen began to tremble slightly. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. Cabinets rattled. Then came a voice. It was muffled and distorted, as if filtered through dirt and wood, but unmistakably human. A man's voice, low and strained, calling out words that blended together under the house. "Help me." Claire sobbed openly now. Evan covered his ears. Lucy shook uncontrollably. Mark shouted back, asking who was there, how they got under the house. The voice answered, closer now, directly beneath the kitchen table. "I'm cold. Please let me in." Mark felt his blood run cold. The crawl space was too shallow for someone to move easily. No one could have entered it during the storm without leaving tracks. No one should have been there at all. The knocking resumed, frantic now, pounding against the floor with both hands. The voice cried out again, louder, more desperate, begging to be let inside before the snow buried him. Mark realized with horror that the voice was wrong. The words were human, but the cadence was off. The pauses between phrases did not match breathing. The tone stayed flat, repeating desperation without changing, like something mimicking fear. The floor, near the crawlspace access door, bowed slightly upward. Claire screamed for Mark not to open anything. He did not intend to. Every instinct told him that whatever was beneath them did not belong inside the house. The pounding grew violent, shaking dishes loose from shelves. The children cried hysterically as the floorboards creaked and strained. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. No knocking, no voice, no movement, only the storm. Minutes passed, then more. The silence felt heavier than the noise had. Mark did not move. He waited, counting seconds in his head, afraid that any sound from them would bring it back. Eventually, exhaustion overtook terror. The children fell asleep in Claire's arms, drained from fear. Mark stayed awake until dawn, sitting against the door with the flashlight and a fireplace poker clenched in his hands. When morning came, the storm had passed. Snow lay deep and untouched around the house. The world outside looked peaceful, innocent, as if nothing had happened. Mark went outside first, carefully circling the house. There were no footprints, no disturbed snow, no sign anyone had been there. He opened the crawlspace door in daylight. Inside, the dirt floor was churned up, marked with deep grooves that looked like handprints dragging through soil. The underside of the floorboards bore fresh scratches, long and uneven, as if something had clawed at them in frustration. There was no sign of a person, no clothing, no tools, no body, just disturbed earth and silence. They moved out of the house before the next winter. The new owners never reported anything unusual, though they did replace the flooring in the kitchen within the first year. Sometimes, on nights when snow falls heavily and the wind sounds just right, Mark still wakes suddenly, convinced he hears knocking. Not at the door, but beneath his feet in this new story. The call came in just after dawn, when the mountain was still wrapped in low cloud and the snow reflected a pale gray light back into the sky. Search and rescue had been looking for Daniel Roque for 5 days, ever since his car was found abandoned at a trailhead with the driver door open and the engine cold. He had gone out for a solo winter hike, something he had done dozens of times before, and then simply vanished into the storm. When the radio crackled with the report that he had been found alive, there was a brief moment of relief before confusion set in. The coordinates did not make sense. Daniel was located nearly 8 miles from the planned route, deep in a ravine that experienced hikers avoided even in summer. He was standing upright when the team reached him, not collapsed or injured, just standing there in the snow as if waiting. They expected hypothermia, confusion, shock. What they did not expect was the way he looked when the clouds shifted. Deputy Nolan reached Daniel first. He called out his name loud and clear, and Daniel turned immediately, eyes focused and alert. His face was pale and drawn, beard stiff with frost, but he responded appropriately to questions. He knew his name. He knew how long he had been missing. He knew where he thought he was supposed to be. He said he had been walking the entire time. Nolan helped him toward the trail, guiding him into clearer light as the fog thinned. That was when one of the volunteers stopped walking. She stared at the ground, then at Daniel, then at the ground again. She asked, very quietly, why he was not casting a shadow. At first, Nolan thought she was joking, a nervous comment after days in the cold. Then he looked down. The sun had broken through the cloud cover just enough to cast long shadows across the snow. The trees stretched dark lines downhill. The rescuers' bodies cast clear outlines that moved with them. Daniel did not. Where his boots stood in the snow, there was only brightness, no dark shape, no outline, nothing trailing behind him, no matter how the angle changed. Nolan stepped closer, blocking the light with his own body. His shadow overlapped Daniel's feet, but when Nolan moved, there was still nothing there. Daniel noticed the pause. He asked what was wrong. No one answered immediately. They got him back to the staging area quickly after that. Hypothermia protocol took precedence. Blankets wrapped around him, warm fluids pressed into his hands. A medic shined a light into his eyes, checked his pupils, asked him to squeeze fingers. Everything was normal. Too normal, given how long he had supposedly been exposed. Daniel kept talking. He said he had not slept much. He said the trail had changed after the storm, that paths felt longer than they should. He said sometimes the forest went very quiet, like sound had been turned off. When asked how he survived without shelter, he shrugged and said he never felt completely alone. They did not ask him to clarify that. Back at the ranger station, the shadow issue became impossible to ignore. Inside the building, under fluorescent lights, it was less obvious. But outside, whenever natural light hit him, the absence returned. Photographs confirmed it. Video showed it. Daniel stood under the sun like a cutout pasted into the world. The official report did not mention shadows. It described a hiker found alive, mildly dehydrated, suffering from exposure, but otherwise coherent. Daniel was released to his family that evening with instructions to rest and follow up medically. The sheriff quietly told everyone involved to keep the rest to themselves until they understood it better. Daniel's sister noticed first when he stepped out onto her porch the next morning. She was carrying laundry, sunlight bright behind her, when she saw him standing on the steps. She stopped so suddenly the basket slipped from her arms. Socks scattered across the porch. She asked him if he was standing under the awning. He said no. She asked him to step forward. He did. Still, nothing. She laughed nervously and said it must be the angle that the sun was strange this time of year. Daniel smiled, but it was a tight smile, one that did not reach his eyes. Inside the house, he seemed almost normal. He ate slowly but steadily. He answered questions patiently. He even joked a little. But when he passed a mirror, he slowed, watching his reflection with an intensity that made his sister uncomfortable. That night, she woke to hear him moving around the living room. She found him standing near the sliding glass door, staring outside at the snow. The porch light was on, casting a sharp shadow of the railing across the yard. Daniel stood in the light. There was still nothing beneath him. She asked what he was doing. He said he was checking to see if it had come back. She asked what had come back. He did not answer. Over the following days, Daniel tried to resume normal life. He showered, he shaved, he went outside during the day. The missing shadow followed him everywhere. Indoors, under artificial light, it was subtle. Outdoors, it was undeniable. People noticed. At the grocery store, a child pointed and asked his mother why that man did not have a shadow. The mother hushed him quickly, glancing around with embarrassment and confusion. At a gas station, a man joked that Daniel must be a vampire. Daniel laughed along, a fraction too late. At night, Daniel stopped sleeping. He said every time he closed his eyes, he felt like something was standing too close, something that did not need light to see him. He said he dreamed of walking through snow that absorbed sound, of leaving footprints that filled themselves in behind him. He said he remembered falling. Not slipping, not collapsing, but falling straight down into darkness that smelled like earth and cold stone. He remembered landing somewhere that did not echo. He remembered standing up and realizing the ground did not reflect him properly. He told his sister that something else had been down there with him. Not an animal, not a person, something that noticed him because he still had a shadow. She told him to stop talking like that. A week later, Daniel agreed to see a doctor. The physician ran tests, ordered scans, suggested stress-induced dissociation, trauma response, lingering hypothermia effects. None of it explained the physical absence that cameras continued to record. The doctor suggested therapy. That night, Daniel went back to the trailhead alone. His sister only realized he was gone when she found his boots missing from the entryway. She drove to the ranger station in a panic, convinced he was going to hurt himself. Search teams mobilized again, faster this time, anger mixed with fear. They found his footprints leading into the forest. Only one set. No shadow in the moonlight, but the footprints were there, pressing deep into fresh snow. They followed them for miles, farther than before, until they reached the ravine where he had been found the first time. At the edge, the footprints stopped. Not faded, not scattered. They simply ended, toes pointed toward empty air. Daniel was never found again. Months later, hikers began reporting something strange in that ravine. On clear days, they said they could see a human-shaped darkness moving against the rock face, detached from anything solid. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if searching. Rangers closed the trail. The official explanation cited erosion risk. Locals told a different story. They said the mountain sometimes took pieces of people, not their bodies, but the parts that proved they belonged to the light. They said if you stayed too long in the quiet places, something might decide you were more useful and complete. On certain winter mornings, when the sun hits the snow just right, search and rescue volunteers swear they can see two shadows moving where only one person stands. One attached, one waiting, and neither one belongs entirely to the man who was found alive. In this new story, the first report came in just after midnight, buried beneath routine calls about road closures and power outages. Two college students had not returned from an evening hike near the northern edge of the state forest, an area locals quietly avoided after dark even during warmer months. Snow had been falling steadily since early afternoon, and by nightfall, the forest roads were already difficult to navigate. At first, authorities assumed the hikers had underestimated the conditions and taken shelter somewhere, planning to return at daylight. By morning, that assumption no longer held. The missing hikers were identified as Nolan Reyes and Carter Webb, both 21, both outdoor recreation majors with several years of hiking experience. They were not reckless beginners. They had proper boots, layered clothing, food, water, and navigation apps on their phones. Friends reported that the two had checked trail maps earlier that day and promised to be back before sunset. Their cars were found parked neatly at the access road, windows cleared of snow, doors locked. Their phones last pinged just after sunset. Search and rescue teams entered the forest at first light. The snowfall had slowed overnight, leaving a thick, untouched blanket across the ground. The forest looked deceptively calm. Tall pines standing close together, branches heavy with snow that muffled sound and distorted distance. Even voices carried strangely, swallowed within a few yards. Tracks were easy to find at first. Two clear sets of boot prints led away from the road and onto a marked trail. The spacing suggested a relaxed pace, side by side, not rushed. Rescuers followed them for nearly a mile without difficulty. Then, the tracks left the trail. They veered sharply to the right, cutting directly between trees instead of following the marked path. The turn was abrupt but clean, as if the decision had been made confidently. There were no signs of slipping, no uneven steps suggesting panic or disorientation. Whoever changed direction knew exactly where they wanted to go. Search leaders exchanged uneasy looks. Less than 40 yards into the trees, the footprints ended. Not gradually, not faded by wind, they simply stopped, as though the snow beyond that point had never been touched. Rescuers circled the area carefully, widening the search radius, but the snow remained pristine. There were no drag marks, no disturbed branches, no impressions suggesting a fall. Search dogs were brought in next. The animals reacted immediately, but not in the way handlers expected. Instead of pulling forward eagerly, several dogs whined, slowed, and refused to advance past the point where the tracks vanished. One dog planted itself in the snow and would not move until it was carried away, shaking violently the entire time. By midday, investigators began interviewing friends more thoroughly. That was when the video surfaced. Earlier that evening, Nolan and Carter had sent a short message to a group chat. The clip was less than 20 seconds long, filmed handheld in fading light. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. The forest behind them was dark, the sky already dimming. Carter laughed and said something about taking a shortcut. Nolan turned the camera slightly. That was when the lights appeared. Several small points of pale illumination flickered between the trees in the distance. They were not bright, but they were steady, hovering at different heights above the ground. They did not sway like lanterns or flash like headlamps. They simply hung there, motionless. Carter joked that it looked like a cabin deeper in the woods. Nolan replied that there were no cabins on the map in that direction. He sounded excited, curious. The camera shifted as they began walking, and the lights seemed to drift farther back, maintaining distance. The video ended abruptly. Search coordinators reviewed maps immediately. There were no structures, no campsites, no utility lines, and no roads anywhere near the direction the lights appeared. No known explanation fit. By the second day, weather conditions worsened. Snowfall intensified, erasing subtle disturbances and forcing search teams to rotate frequently to avoid frostbite. Radios crackled with interference that came and went without pattern. Several volunteers reported seeing faint lights deeper in the forest, always just beyond the established search boundary. Each time someone pointed them out and turned directly toward them, the lights vanished. That evening, one of the rangers admitted quietly that this was not the first time lights had been reported in that section of forest. Similar sightings appeared in older incident logs, often connected to missing persons cases that were never fully resolved. The reports were inconsistent, spread across decades, but the descriptions matched too closely to ignore. On the third day, a disturbing discovery shifted the search entirely. A backpack was found hanging from a tree branch nearly 10 feet above the ground. It belonged to Nolan. The straps were intact, not torn or stretched. The zipper worked smoothly. Inside were dry clothes, unopened food bars, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. The flashlight was turned off. There were no footprints beneath the tree, no marks on the bark suggesting someone had climbed. The branch itself showed no damage. Searchers noticed something else nearby. The snow around the tree was marked with small circular patches where the surface appeared slightly melted, then refrozen. The patches were evenly spaced, leading deeper into the forest in a loose, winding line, like a trail where something warm had hovered briefly above the ground. That night, a member of the search team nearly disappeared as well. He radioed in that he was following what he believed were headlamps ahead of him, assuming another group had moved forward without notifying base. His voice was calm at first. Then it changed. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. When contact was re-established several minutes later, his voice sounded distant and disoriented. He said the forest felt wrong, quieter than it should be. He said the trees looked farther apart than before, like the space between them was stretching. He could not explain how long he had been walking. He was found less than 50 feet from base camp, standing perfectly still at the tree line, staring into darkness. He did not remember leaving. He did not remember seeing lights. He only remembered feeling like something wanted him to keep going. After that, the search was suspended. Official statements cited worsening weather, unstable terrain, and the risk to personnel. Nolan Reyes and Carter Webb were listed as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. The families were told everything possible had been done. Unofficially, rangers shared stories among themselves. They spoke of strange lights that appeared every winter after heavy snowfall, always deep in the forest, always just far enough away to invite pursuit. They spoke of people who followed them and were never found, and of a few who returned changed, quiet, unable to explain where they had been. In spring, when the snow finally melted, teams returned for a final sweep. They found fragments of clothing embedded in ice near a ravine, too degraded to identify conclusively. They found a phone crushed beyond repair, its casing warped as if exposed to intense heat. They never found bodies. The case files were closed without ceremony. The forest reopened by summer. Hikers returned. Life moved on. But every winter, when snow falls thick and the woods grow unnaturally quiet, locals still report seeing lights between the trees. They hover patiently, steady and pale, never flickering, never moving closer on their own. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind dies and sound carries too far, people swear they can hear voices drifting through the forest, laughing at first, then calling out softly, inviting someone to follow. No one who does has ever made it back. In this new story, the snowman appeared sometime during the night, positioned in the narrow clearing between the back fence and the line of pine trees bordering the property. Mark noticed it first just after dawn, standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee maker to finish. His eyes caught on a pale vertical shape outside the sliding glass door, something that broke the smooth pattern of untouched snow in the yard. It stood taller than most snowmen, built with unusual precision, its rounded sections stacked evenly as if measured. The head was smooth and slightly elongated, not lopsided or playful like something made by children in a hurry. For a moment, Mark felt a flicker of amusement. A late-night prank, he thought, probably teenagers wandering after the storm. He called Aaron into the kitchen and pointed it out casually, already turning back to his mug. Their dog reacted instantly. Luca, a medium-sized rescue they had adopted years earlier, froze near the door, body rigid, ears pinned back. A low growl rolled out of his chest, deep and sustained, nothing like the warning barks he gave at delivery trucks. His eyes were locked on the snowman, unblinking, pupils wide. Aaron stepped closer, confused, and said Luca's name softly. The growl turned into sharp, frantic barking as Luca lunged at the glass, slamming his front paws against it hard enough to make the door rattle. Aaron jumped back in surprise while Mark grabbed the dog's collar to pull him away. The snowman did not move. Luca continued barking even after being dragged into the living room, his body trembling, claws scraping the floor as he strained to face the yard again. Aaron tried calming him with treats and gentle commands, but Luca ignored everything, eyes still fixed on the door as if something outside might suddenly charge in. Mark frowned, his earlier amusement fading. Luca had never behaved like this before, not even during thunderstorms or when unfamiliar people approached the house. He told himself dogs sometimes reacted strangely to unfamiliar shapes, especially after heavy snowfall that altered familiar landmarks. Still, the intensity unsettled him. Through the glass, the snowman stood facing the house directly. Someone had used small, dark stones for eyes and long branches for arms. One arm extended slightly forward, the other angled downward, giving it an unbalanced posture that felt less playful the longer Mark looked at it. There was no scarf, no hat, no decoration meant to make it friendly. It looked unfinished. By mid-morning, Luca's barking had reduced to a constant low growl, but he refused to leave the area near the door. He paced back and forth, stopping every few seconds to stare at the snowman, lips pulled back just enough to show his teeth. Aaron closed the curtains partway to block the view, but Luca continued reacting as if the figure were still visible. Mark tried to distract himself with work emails, though his eyes kept drifting back to the window. Around noon, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The snowman was closer. At first, he thought it was a trick of perspective. Snowbanks shift subtly as light changes, and the clearing slope made distances deceptive. Still, the space between the snowman and the fence looked smaller than before. Mark put on boots and a coat and stepped outside despite Luca's frantic protests. The cold bit immediately. Mark walked to the fence line and measured the distance from where the snowman stood to the trees. It was shorter than it should have been. The snowman now stood several feet closer to the house than where he clearly remembered seeing it earlier. There were no footprints. The snow between the original spot and its current position was smooth and untouched, the surface unbroken except for wind-carved ripples. No drag marks, no compressed paths. Nothing to suggest the snowman had been moved. Mark backed away slowly, heart pounding, and returned inside. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. Aaron could tell something was wrong immediately. That night, Luca refused to sleep. He paced the house restlessly, barking every time he passed the sliding door. Aaron lay awake, listening, the sound gnawing at her nerves. Mark eventually got up around 2 a.m. and carefully pulled one edge of the curtain aside. The snowman now stood at the edge of the patio. It was close enough that Mark could see faint impressions in its surface, small areas where the snow looked compressed as if shaped around something beneath. The stones used for eyes reflected the porch light faintly, catching the glow in a way that suggested focus. One branch arm pointed directly toward the door. Mark closed the curtain slowly, his hands shaking. They did not call the police. They did not call neighbors. There was no explanation that sounded sane enough to say out loud. Instead, they locked every door and window and tried to sleep in short, anxious intervals while Luca kept watch. Morning brought no relief. The snowman now stood inches from the sliding door, so close its shadow pressed against the glass. A dark, wet ring circled its base where the snow beneath had partially melted, as though something warm had stood there for hours. Luca barked until his voice grew hoarse, then collapsed into low, whimpering sounds. Aaron had never heard from him before. Up close, details became clearer and more disturbing. The surface of the snowman was uneven in places, subtly bulging and narrowing in ways that did not match normal packing. The branches used as arms were snapped cleanly from nearby pines, their broken ends buried deep into the snow body. Shallow grooves curved downward where a mouth might have been, pressed deliberately into the surface. Mark called in sick to work without explanation. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped again. The sky darkened early, thick clouds rolling in ahead of another storm. Erin noticed Luca pressing himself against her legs whenever he rested, trembling whenever his eyes flicked toward the door. Late that afternoon, Erin saw it. She was standing in the kitchen when she noticed the surface of the snowman shift. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that the light was changing. Then she saw it again. The snowman was breathing. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The rounded chest rose and fell slowly, rhythmically. With each movement, faint wisps of frost drifted outward like breath in cold air. Erin screamed for Mark. By the time he reached the door, the movement had stopped. The snowman stood perfectly still again, silent and massive. Mark grabbed a shovel from the mudroom, his jaw tight, ready to destroy whatever nightmare stood outside. Erin stopped him. She begged him not to open the door, her voice shaking as she described what she had seen. Mark wanted to argue, to cling to action, but fear rooted him in place. He lowered the shovel slowly, every instinct screaming that stepping outside would be a mistake. Night fell quickly. The power went out just after sunset, plunging the house into darkness, broken only by flashlight beams and distant lightning flashes behind the trees. Outside, the snowman loomed inches from the glass, its outline visible in stark contrast whenever lightning lit the yard. Luca hid under the dining table, trembling violently. He barked only when the snowman moved. They heard it before they saw it. A slow scraping sound carried through the glass, the sound of compacted snow shifting against concrete. The snowman rotated gradually, impossibly, turning its body toward the center of the door. One branch arm lifted, snow cascading from it in small, silent falls. The glass fogged as something warm pressed against it from outside. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate. One knock, a long pause, another knock. Erin covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Mark stood frozen, flashlight beam shaking in his hand. Luca barked once, then went silent, eyes wide, body locked. A shape pressed against the glass, smearing frost away. For a brief, horrifying moment, Mark saw something beneath the snow surface. Pale, stretched skin. A suggestion of a face pressed outward, features blurred as if the cold had only barely held them together. The knocking stopped. The snowman collapsed inward, its structure failing all at once. Branches clattered onto the patio as the snow sloughed away. What remained at the door was no longer a snowman, but something half revealed, half concealed, as if the frozen shell had only been a temporary disguise. Mark never remembered opening the door. He remembered waking on the floor, head ringing, Erin shaking him desperately. The sliding door stood wide open, snow blowing inside. The patio was empty. No snowman, no branches, no footprints. Only a single deep impression in the snow, shaped unmistakably like a human body that had been lying there for a long time. Luca never went into the yard again. They moved before winter ended, abandoning the house with snow still piled high against the fence. The new owners never mentioned anything unusual, only that their dog refused to go near the back clearing. Sometimes, during heavy snowfall, Erin still dreams of a figure standing just beyond the glass, waiting patiently. And sometimes, in those dreams, it moves. In this new story, the letter appeared on the inside of her kitchen window during the coldest morning the town had recorded in years. Frost coated the glass in a thick, pale film, turning the outside streetlight into a blurred circle. Mara Levinson pulled the curtain aside to check the snowfall, then stopped as her breath caught sharply. Words sat in the frost, written backward so they read correctly only from inside the kitchen. The letters were smooth and careful, shaped with the steady pressure of a finger against ice. They spelled her full name with a precision that made her stomach tighten. Mara Levinson. Under her name, a second line curved downward, thinner where the frost began to soften near the window frame. Do not leave the house tonight. If you do, you will not come back. The warning felt too direct to dismiss as coincidence, and too personal to be a prank. Mara leaned closer, studying the strokes like a proofreader examining a signature. Each letter had the same slight slant she used when she wrote quickly on envelopes. The spacing matched her habit of leaving narrow gaps between words. Even the way the final period sat heavy at the end looked familiar. For several seconds, she stood perfectly still, listening for a sound outside the house. The heater clicked and resumed its low cycle, pushing warm air through old vents. Somewhere in the walls, plumbing settled with a faint tick. Nothing else moved, and the silence made the message feel even louder. Her first instinct was to check the exterior of the window. She grabbed her coat from the back of a chair, shoved her feet into boots, and stepped into the brittle air. Snow squeaked under her weight, sharp and dry, while the sky held a washed-out pre-dawn color. She rounded the side of the house and approached the kitchen window from outside. The glass looked smooth, coated only in a thin, natural frost pattern. No smears, no finger lines, no scratches, nothing suggesting anyone had touched it. The yard showed no footprints near the wall, only wind-brushed ripples across untouched snow. Mara returned inside, heart beating harder now. The words were still there, crisp and undisturbed, like they had been printed rather than traced. She raised her hand and hovered her fingertips near the message without touching it. The frost looked thick enough to hold the imprint of a nail, yet it remained perfectly intact. She took her phone from the counter and snapped several photos, changing angles to catch glare. Every image captured the writing clearly, each letter bright against the frosted background. She zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, searching for distortions that might reveal a trick. The lines remained clean, as though the message belonged to the glass itself. Below the warning, a final line had formed, thinner and already melting near the bottom edge. I know you will try to understand. Please trust me instead. The words made her feel strangely exposed, as if someone knew the exact way her mind worked. Mara lived alone in a small rental house at the edge of town, a place most people passed without noticing. She worked remotely as a technical editor, spending her days correcting other people's sentences with quiet patience. Her routine was strict, built to keep her steady after a series of life changes she rarely discussed. This message did not fit anywhere inside that carefully maintained order. She rushed to find paper and a pen, afraid the message would vanish with the rising sun. The kitchen warmed slowly as the heater fought the night's cold, and the frost began to thin in irregular patches. Mara copied every word in her own handwriting, then copied them again, trying to preserve the shapes exactly. Within minutes, the letters on the glass softened into streaks, then disappeared entirely. The window returned to ordinary transparency, reflecting her face back at her with a faint, ghostly distortion. Mara stood there, holding the paper, staring at the blank pane, feeling foolish and frightened at the same time. She spent the morning trying to explain it away with rational language. A temperature anomaly could create patterns that looked like writing, especially to a tired mind searching for meaning. A neighbor might have written something on the outside that later transferred through condensation, though the outside glass showed nothing. A dream could have overlapped waking perception, leaving her convinced she saw something that never existed. Yet the photos remained on her phone, unchanged and precise. They were proof that the message had been real in a way her mind could not rewrite. Mara opened the photos again and again, checking that the letters remained stable. Each time she looked, she felt the same sharp recognition of her own style. By afternoon, the cold outside deepened again, and a thin new frost started creeping along the lower edges of the windows. Mara kept the curtains open, watching for any new pattern, half expecting the message to return. She told herself she would call someone for reassurance, but she did not know who would believe her without pity. The first person she considered was her friend Elise, who lived across town and worked as a nurse. Elise had seen enough strange behavior in patients to suspect a medical explanation, which Mara feared more than a paranormal one. Mara imagined Elise suggesting stress, sleep deprivation, or some emerging episode that would require evaluation. The idea made her stomach twist. Mara made tea instead and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the paper where she had copied the message. Do not leave the house tonight. If you do, you will not come back. She repeated the warning silently, trying to test how it felt in her mouth, like a phrase from a bad movie. The words refused to lose their weight. As daylight faded, the temperature dropped again with sudden speed. Frost returned to the windows in fine branching lines, thicker than before. Mara turned on every lamp in the house, filling corners with warm light, as if brightness could make logic return. She checked each lock twice, then checked them again. At 4 in the afternoon, she stepped into the bathroom and turned on the shower to warm herself. Steam filled the room quickly, fogging the mirror until it became a milky blur. Mara wiped a clear circle with her palm, then froze as letters emerged along the edge of the fog. They were written backward, appearing as the condensation settled. You are going to think this is a prank. It is not. The words had the same careful slope, the same spacing, the same pressure of invisible hands. Mara backed away until her shoulders hit the doorframe. Her mind raced through physical explanations, but none held long enough to calm her breathing. A hidden marker could appear through steam, yet the mirror was clean and she lived alone. A scratch pattern could reveal itself under fog, yet the letters were too smooth and complete. The message looked freshly written, as if the steam simply revealed what had been placed there moments earlier. Mara wiped the mirror with a towel, and the letters vanished immediately. She stared at the blank glass, heart pounding, as the shower continued running behind her. She turned off the water, wrapped herself in a robe, and left the bathroom with damp hair and shaking hands. Now, there were 2 messages, both anticipating her doubts. The sense of being observed tightened around her thoughts like cold thread. She returned to the kitchen and opened the photos again, comparing them to her own handwriting on the paper. The match was undeniable. She did the only thing she could think of that felt practical. She began documenting everything as if it were a case file. She noted the time of each message, the location, the exact wording. She saved photos to a secure folder, then emailed them to herself as a backup. She wrote a short summary in a document, the kind she would normally edit for a client. At sunset, the house creaked as the temperature dropped further. Wind rose and pushed snow against the siding in soft thumps. Mara looked through the front window and saw only a quiet street and the faint glow of a distant lamp. Nothing moved outside, yet she could not shake the feeling that someone waited just beyond sight. She remembered she had planned an errand that night, a late drive to pick up a package held at a locker station. The email reminder sat in her inbox, scheduled for pickup before midnight to avoid return. It was a minor task, the kind of thing she would normally do without thinking. The warning on the window suddenly had a shape that fit her life. Do not leave the house tonight. If you do, you will not come back. The message did not say why, which made it worse. It left space for every possible explanation. As darkness settled fully, Mara heard a faint scrape from the garage door area. She moved toward it slowly, holding her breath, then realized the sound was ice shifting along the metal track. Even ordinary noises felt threatening now, transformed by her heightened attention. She returned to the kitchen and sat down again, forcing herself to breathe. At 9, she checked her phone settings and turned the ringer off entirely. She placed the phone face down on the table and told herself she would not look at it. Within minutes, she looked anyway, unable to stop herself. The screen remained dark. At 10:30, she walked into the garage to take out trash, then stopped when she saw her car windshield. A thin layer of ice had formed on the inside, an impossible detail in a closed garage that was not that cold. Written across the ice in reversed letters was another message. You will get a call tonight. You must not answer it. Mara sank onto the cold concrete, back against the wall, staring at the words until her eyes ached. The messages were not random warnings anymore. They described specific events, and the specificity felt like a trap. She thought of her phone lying face down in the kitchen, silent and waiting. She forced herself to stand, grabbed the trash bag without taking her eyes off the windshield, and returned inside. She locked the door between the garage and the kitchen, then slid a chair against it, though she knew the gesture was symbolic. She looked around her living room as if searching for hidden speakers, cameras, any sign of intrusion. The house offered only ordinary clutter and familiar shadows. At 11, Mara poured water into a glass and watched her hand shake. She tried to call Elise, then stopped before pressing the button. If the messages were real, involving someone else could pull them into danger. If the messages were not real, calling someone would confirm she was losing control. Either path felt wrong. At 11:30, she set a kettle on the stove, but forgot to turn it on. She sat again and stared at the clock, watching the minute hand crawl. Her body held tension like a held breath. Every time the heater clicked, she jumped. At 11:45, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at her driveway. Snow lay smooth, unbroken, reflecting the porch light faintly. She imagined herself putting on boots, grabbing keys, and stepping outside toward her car. She imagined the engine turning over, the tires crunching through snow, the road empty and dark. At 11:47, she stayed inside. The minute passed without any obvious change, yet Mara felt as if she had crossed a line. She did not feel relief, only a deeper fear that the event she avoided might still reach for her through another door. She walked into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, fully clothed, lights on, waiting. Just after midnight, the landline rang. Mara stared at it from the hallway, frozen. She barely used that number, and only a few services still had it. The ringing sounded too loud for the quiet house, like an alarm rather than a call. She remembered the message on the car windshield and did not move. The ringing stopped after several seconds. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed once against the table, a single vibration like a small pulse. She resisted looking at it. She waited until her breathing steadied, then forced herself to glance. A missed call notification sat on the screen from an unknown number. She felt a cold wave move through her chest. The message on the windshield had been correct. The call had come, and she had not answered. Mara walked to the kitchen window, expecting nothing, and found new writing forming in thin frost along the lower edge. "Thank you for not answering." The words were faint, yet readable, as if the writer used less ice this time. Mara pressed her palm to her mouth and began to cry silently, overwhelmed by the idea that her actions were being monitored in real time. She did not wipe the window. She watched the letters until they faded naturally as warm air rose from the vent below. The gratitude felt more frightening than the warnings. It implied the writer cared, and that care suggested a history between them. Mara sat at the table and opened her laptop, searching for any record of similar events. She typed phrases about ice riding, condensation messages, time warnings. The results were useless, full of folklore and unreliable stories. She shut the laptop with sudden anger, then immediately regretted the noise. Near 1 in the morning, frost thickened again, spreading across the bedroom window in branching veins. Mara lay on her bed without sleeping, staring at the glass. She told herself that if another message appeared, she would demand an explanation. She would not accept riddles anymore. The next message formed slowly while she watched, as if the ice needed time to gather enough structure for letters. The lines appeared backward at first, then sharpened into words. "This is the hardest part to believe, so read carefully." Mara sat up, heart pounding, and leaned close to the window. The writing continued, each letter growing from thin white thread into solid frost. "I am you, 12 years from now." Mara whispered no repeatedly, shaking her head, as if denial could erase the letters. The message did not stop. "You do not remember how this starts, because when it ends, you will choose not to." Mara felt her throat tighten. She tried to speak through it anyway, voice low and trembling. She asked how that could be possible, and whether someone was trying to break her mind. Her words fogged the glass near the writing, briefly blurring a few letters. The ice continued forming beneath her breath, correcting itself, stubborn and steady. "I am writing, because this is the last winter you can still change it." Mara pressed her forehead to the cold glass, eyes closed, trying to keep from falling apart. She forced herself to read each line, then read it again, as if repetition might reveal a hidden code. "What happens tonight?" she whispered, though the time had already passed. The response appeared almost immediately, the ice thickening where the letters would be. "Tonight, you were supposed to leave at 11:47. You were supposed to drive. You were supposed to die." The words struck her like a physical impact. Mara pulled back from the window, breath coming in short, painful bursts. She thought of the route to the locker station, a stretch of road that curved along a riverbank and iced over easily. She thought of headlights, black ice, the sudden loss of control. The scenario felt too plausible, which made it worse. "Why?" she whispered, barely able to form the word. "Because I did not listen." The next line formed slowly, as if it required effort. "I tried to outthink it. I tried to force a different outcome. I survived, but not intact." Mara stared at the words survived, then at not intact, and felt terror shift into something heavier. Survival was not comfort if it came with damage. The idea that she could become a future version of herself shaped by trauma made her feel trapped in a narrow corridor. "This is the only version where I am allowed to warn you." Allowed by what? Mara thought. But her voice could not form the question. The ice answered something close to it anyway. There are rules. There are lines. Some things push back when you try to change them. Mara felt her pulse in her fingertips. She wanted to call someone, to hear a living voice that belonged to ordinary time. Yet the earlier warning about the call made her hesitate. She could not know which voices were safe now. The letters continued forming, thinner than before, as if the frost were struggling against rising warmth from inside the room. "If you stay inside tonight, the first crack never happens." Mara swallowed hard, reading the line twice. "If you leave, you become me." The final words formed, then began to fade at the edges almost immediately. Mara reached for her phone and took photos through trembling hands, afraid the message would vanish and take the only explanation with it. She captured each line, then took more, adjusting angles to preserve clarity. Within minutes, the frost thinned and the letters softened into pale smears. The window returned to a simple pattern of cold and light. Mara sat back against the wall and stared into the quiet room, feeling both spared and hunted. She did not sleep at all that night. She watched the clock until morning, expecting something else to happen, some punishment for refusing the path described. Nothing came. The house remained ordinary. The street outside remained empty. The world moved forward as if no one had written her fate in ice. By daylight, the temperature rose slightly and the windows cleared. The messages did not return. Mara made coffee and tried to steady her hands enough to drink without spilling. She checked her call log again and saw the missed call still there, the number still unknown. She resisted the urge to call it back. Later that day, she drove in daylight to retrieve the package, choosing a different route than she had planned for the night before. She avoided the river road entirely. On the way home, she noticed every patch of shade, every glint that might indicate ice. Fear sharpened her attention into an exhausting alertness. Over the following weeks, winter continued with normal storms and normal cold. Mara kept documenting everything, yet no new messages appeared on any surface. She checked windows each morning, half expecting frost to spell her name again. The glass remained blank. The silence felt like an aftershock. Mara began changing her routines in small, deliberate ways. She stopped doing late errands, she added extra lights outside, she bought a new lock for the garage door. She scheduled a medical checkup and spoke carefully with a doctor about sleep and anxiety, leaving out the ice messages while still seeking support. Nothing abnormal appeared in tests, which made her feel both relieved and unsettled. As months passed, the intensity of fear softened, but the memory never truly left. She kept the photos backed up in multiple places and printed them in a folder, labeling dates and times like evidence. Some nights, she reread the messages and tried to imagine the future self who wrote them, older, possibly damaged, still caring enough to reach back. She wondered what rules the messages referred to and what force allowed a warning but limited how much could be said. She wondered whether the unknown number belonged to an ordinary person in a wrong place or something that used the network like a fishing line. The questions had no answers that satisfied her. Years later, Mara moved away from that rental house and into a different town with a different winter. She built a life that leaned toward daylight and company. She made friends who understood her need for plans and caution without mocking it. Yet every time deep cold arrived and frost returned to windows, she felt her body tense automatically. On certain mornings, when ice traced fine patterns along glass, she would lean close and search for letters. She never found her name again. She never found another warning. Still, she sometimes sensed a presence in the quiet, not in the room, but in her own awareness, like a distant point of attention watching to make sure she stayed on track. She kept the printed photos in a sealed folder in her desk, not because she enjoyed the memory, but because it anchored her. It reminded her that one night mattered, and that her choices had weight beyond comfort. It reminded her that the future was not a clean, straight line, but a fragile surface that could crack. On the coldest mornings, when her breath fogged the window and the world outside looked paused, Mara sometimes whispered a thank you into the glass. Not to the ice, not to the house she left behind, but to the version of herself who reached back with trembling patience. If that future self still existed somewhere, Mara hoped she was less alone now. If the warning changed everything, Mara hoped the damage described never formed. Yet even if the future remained uncertain, Mara knew one thing with a clarity that stayed sharp through every winter. She had listened. In this new story, the lodge brochure described it as a quiet winter retreat tucked deep into the mountains, accessible by one maintained road and surrounded by dense pine forest. The photographs showed warm amber lights glowing through tall windows, heavy timber beams darkened by age, and wide snow-covered slopes untouched by tracks. For Hannah and Paul Merrick, it looked like the perfect place to disappear for several days, far from deadlines, notifications, and the steady pressure that had followed them through the past year. They arrived in late January during a cold spell that had settled over the region like a lid. The drive took longer than expected, partly because snowbanks narrowed the road into a single pale corridor. Their headlights reflected off the walls of snow, creating the uneasy feeling of driving through a tunnel. Halfway up the mountain, the radio dissolved into static and never recovered. Paul joked that it felt like driving off the map, though Hannah noticed he stopped joking after a while. The lodge appeared suddenly around a bend, emerging from falling snow as though it had been waiting. Every window glowed with steady yellow light, and smoke rose straight from the chimney into the dark sky. A wooden sign stood near the entrance, its carved letters rimmed with ice. Hannah felt a physical sense of relief at the sight of it, the kind that comes when shelter finally appears after a long exposure to cold. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin, old wood, and heat soaked into stone. A large fireplace dominated the main room, flames cracking softly. Several guests sat scattered across couches and chairs, some reading, others staring into the fire. Their voices were low, measured, as if the building encouraged quiet. A woman behind the front desk looked up and smiled, her expression calm and professional in a way that felt slightly rehearsed. She welcomed them by name without checking identification, then handed Paul a heavy brass key attached to a wooden tag. Hannah noticed there was no computer on the desk, only a large leather-bound book open to a marked page. The pages were filled with neat, handwritten names, each paired with room numbers and dates written in the same careful script. Paul signed their names where indicated. As Hannah leaned closer, a faint unease settled in her chest. The handwriting around their entry looked old-fashioned, formal in a way she associated with archival documents rather than modern guest logs. Some dates were decades apart, yet none of the names were crossed out or marked as checked out. Their room sat on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. The floorboards creaked softly underfoot, the sound echoing farther than expected. Their room was warm and comfortable, with thick blankets, a small fireplace, and a window facing the forest. Snow clung to the glass, muting the outside world. Everything looked exactly like the brochure, which reassured Paul more than it reassured Hannah. That evening, they joined the other guests for dinner in the dining room. A long wooden table held simple food, served family style, soups and bread steaming gently in the cool air. Conversation remained polite, but oddly shallow. No one mentioned where they were from or how long they planned to stay. When Hannah asked a man across from her whether he came up often, he smiled faintly and said only that he had been there before. Paul dismissed the strangeness later, suggesting people came here to escape personal details. Hannah wanted to believe that, but the rhythm of the evening felt wrong. The guests seemed attentive yet distant, present without engaging. No phones appeared on the table. No one checked the time. When dinner ended, everyone rose quietly and drifted away without exchanging goodnights. That night, Hannah woke briefly to the sound of the lodge settling. Wind brushed the windows, and somewhere below, she thought she heard slow footsteps crossing the lobby. When she checked the time, it was just before 3 in the morning. Paul slept heavily beside her. She lay awake for a long time afterward, listening, until the sounds faded into silence. The next morning, snow fell thick and steady. Breakfast was laid out early, and the same guests from the night before appeared again, seated in the same places, wearing the same clothes. Hannah noticed none of them seemed to have changed outfits. The detail felt petty, yet it lingered in her thoughts. She asked the woman at the front desk whether many guests extended their stays. The woman smiled and said guests stayed as long as they needed. The answer sounded practiced. Hannah glanced again at the guest book and noticed some names appeared multiple times across the pages, written years apart, always assigned to the same rooms. She pointed this out to Paul upstairs. He frowned and suggested the book simply recorded repeat visitors. Hannah tried to accept that explanation, but the dates unsettled her. Some entries stretched back decades without any departure noted. The handwriting never changed, never aged. Later that afternoon, Paul went outside to take photographs while Hannah stayed by the fireplace. As she read, she overheard 2 older guests speaking quietly nearby. One said winter here never truly ended, that the lodge existed outside normal seasons. The other nodded as though this was obvious. When Hannah looked up, they fell silent and smiled politely. That evening, curiosity overcame politeness. Hannah asked if she could look more closely at the guest book, explaining she loved old ledgers. The woman hesitated briefly, then slid the book toward her. As Hannah turned the pages, her unease deepened. Names repeated across decades with no checkout dates. Some stays spanned multiple winters. One name appeared continuously for nearly 60 years. Paul leaned over her shoulder and froze when he recognized a surname. It belonged to his grandfather, who had vanished during a winter storm long before Paul was born. The date beside the name matched the winter of the disappearance, a family story never fully explained. Paul felt his chest tighten as he traced the ink. Hannah looked up and realized the lobby had gone unnaturally quiet. The other guests sat motionless, their attention subtly focused on the desk. Paul asked what kind of lodge this was. The woman closed the book gently and said it was a place for people who lost their way during winter, where time slowed enough for rest. Hannah asked whether guests ever left. The woman said some did when they remembered where they were going. Others stayed because leaving felt harder. Snow intensified outside, pressing against the windows until the forest disappeared. Paul squeezed Hannah's hand and said they needed to leave. The woman did not stop them, only mentioned that the roads sometimes vanished overnight. They hurried upstairs. Along the hallway, Hannah noticed doors slightly open. Inside, she glimpsed outdated clothing, old suitcases, and personal items coated in dust rather than snow. Each room felt preserved, like a paused moment from a different decade. Back in their room, Hannah checked the window. Their car sat outside, already half buried. Snow fell fast enough to erase tracks. Panic settled heavy in her chest. That night, neither of them slept. Voices drifted through the lodge at irregular intervals, low and indistinct, like conversations carried through walls. At one point, Hannah was certain someone stood outside their door, breathing slowly. Paul listened too, heart pounding, yet the handle never turned. Just before dawn, the sounds stopped. Morning light revealed a calm landscape. The storm had eased, and the road lay visible again, freshly plowed. They packed quickly and went downstairs. The lobby stood empty. No guests, no fire. The front desk was unattended, and the guest book was gone. Only their car keys rested neatly on the counter. They left without speaking. Weeks later, Hannah searched online for the lodge. The website no longer existed. The address led to an undeveloped stretch of forest. Old local archives mentioned a lodge that once stood there but closed after a winter avalanche killed several guests decades earlier. Survivors claimed some people were never found. Paul avoided the subject afterward. Hannah could not. Every winter, when snow fell heavy and silence deepened, she thought about the guest list and the names that never checked out. Sometimes she wondered whether the lodge still waited in the mountains, lights glowing steadily, pages filling patiently, ready for travelers who lost their way and stayed just a little too long.